Hey guys, welcome back to Reading Time with Parker and Trevor. Today we're continuing reading Hatchet by Gary Paulson. I'll be reading chapter 11. Remember, at the end of chapter 10, Brian had found some turtle eggs that he's going to be using as food. He's going to eat some, and then he's going to store some for later. So, let's see what Brian gets into in chapter 11. There were things to do. He transferred all the eggs from the small beach into the shelter, reburying them near his sleeping area. It took all of his will to keep them from eating. It took all his will to keep from eating another one as he moved them, but he got it done. And when they were out of sight again, it was easier. He added wood to the fire and cleaned up the camp area. A good laugh. That cleaning the camp, all he did was shake out his windbreaker and hang it in the sun to dry the berry juice that had soaked in and smooth the sand where he slept. But it was a mental thing. He had gotten depressed thinking about how they hadn't found him yet, and when he was busy and had something to do, the depression seemed to leave. So there were things to do. With the camp squared away, he brought in more wood. He had decided to always have enough on hand for 3 days, and after spending one night with the fire for a friend, he knew what a staggering amount of wood it would take. He worked all through the morning at the wood, breaking down dead limbs and breaking or chopping them into smaller pieces, storing them neatly beneath the overhang. He stopped once to take a drink at the lake, and in his reflection he saw that the swelling on his head was nearly gone. There was no pain there, so he assumed that had taken care of itself. His leg was also back to normal, although he had a small pattern of holes, roughly star-shaped, where the quills had nailed him. And while he was standing at the lake shore, taking his socks, he noticed that his body was changing. He had never been fat, but he had been slightly heavy with a little extra weight just above his belt at the sides. This was completely gone, and his stomach had caved in to the hunger, and the sun had cooked him past burning, so he was tanning. And with the smoke from the fire in his face was starting to look like leather. But perhaps more than his body was the change in his mind, or in the way he was becoming. I am not the same, he thought. I hear differently. He did not know when the change started, but it was there. When a sound came to him now, he didn't just hear, but he would know the sound. He could swing and look at it, a breaking twig, a movement of air, and know the sound as if he had somehow could move his mind back down the wave of sound to the source. He could know what the sound was before he quite realized he had heard it, and when he saw something, a bird moving a wing inside a bush or a ripple of the water, he would truly see that thing, not just notice it as he used to notice things in the city. He would see all parts of it, see the whole wing, the feathers, see the color of the feathers, see the bush and the size and shape and color of its leaves. He would see the way the light moved with the ripples on the water, and see that the wind made the ripples, in which way the wind had to blow to make the ripples move in that certain way. None of that used to be in Brian, and now it was a part of him, a changed part of him, a grown part of him, and the two things, his mind and his body, had come together as well, had made a connection with each other that he didn't quite understand. When his ears heard a sound or his eyes saw a sight, his mind took control of his body. Without his thinking, he moved to face the sound or sight, moved to make ready for it, to deal with it. There were these things to do. When the wood was done, he decided to get a signal fire ready. He moved to the top of the rock ridge that compromised the bluff over his shelter, and was pleased to find a large flat stone area. More wood, he thought, moaning inwardly. He went back to the fallen trees and found more dead limbs, carrying them up on the rock until he had enough for a bonfire. Initially, he had thought of making a signal fire every day, but he couldn't. He would never be able to keep the wood supply going. So while he was working, he decided to have the fire ready if he heard an engine, or even thought he heard a plane engine. He would run up with a burning limb and set off the signal fire. Things to do. At the last trip to the top of the stone bluff with wood, he stopped, sat on the point overlooking the lake, and rested. The lake lay before him, 20 or so feet below, and he had not seen it this way since he had come in with the plane. Remembering the crash, he had a moment of fear, a breath-tightening little rip of terror, but it passed and he quickly caught up with the beauty of the scenery. It was so incredibly beautiful that it was almost unreal. From his height, he could see not just the lake, but across part of the forest, a green carpet, and it was full of life. Birds, insects, there was a constant hum and song. At the other end of the bottom of the L, there was another large rock sticking out over the water. And on top of the rock, a snaggly pond had somehow found food and grown, bent and gnarled. Sitting on one limb was a blue bird with a crest and a sharp beak. A kingfisher, he thought of a picture he had seen once, which left the branch while he was watched and dove into the water. It emerged a split part of a second later. In its mouth was a small fish, wiggling silver in the sun. It took the fish to a limb, joggled it twice, and swallowed it whole. Fish, of course, he thought. There was fish in the lake, and they were food. And if a bird could do it, he scrambled down the side of the bluff and trotted to the edge of the lake, looking down into the water. Somehow it had never occurred to him to look inside the water, only at the surface. The sun was flashing back up into his eyes, and he moved off the side and took his shoes off in the water 15 feet. Then he turned and stood still, with the sun at his back, and studied the water again. It was, he saw after a moment, literally packed with life. Small fish swam everywhere, somehow some narrow and some long, some round, and most of them maybe 3 or 4 inches long, some a bit bigger and many smaller. There was a patch of mud off the side, leading into deeper water, and you could see old clamshells there, so there must be clams. As he watched, a crayfish looking like a tiny lobster left one of the empty clamshells and went into another, looking for something to eat, digging with its claws. While he stood, some of the small rounded fish came quite close to his legs, and he tensed, got ready, and made a wild step at grabbing one of them. They exploded away in a hundred flicks of quick light, so fast that he had no hope of catching them that way. But they soon come back, seemed to be curious about him, and as he walked from the water, he tried to think of a way that curiosity to catch them. He had no hooks or strings, but if he could make something how to lure them into the shallows and make a spear, a small fish spear, he might be able to strike fast enough to get one. He would have to find the right kind of wood, slim and straight. He had seen some willows up along the lake that might work, and he would use the hatchet to sharpen it and shape it while he was sitting by the fire tonight. And that brought up the fire, which he had to feed again. He looked at the sun and saw it was getting late in the afternoon, and when he thought of how late it was, he thought that he ought to reward all this work with another egg, and it made him think of some kind of dessert would be nice. He smiled when he thought of dessert so fancy, and he wondered if he should move up the lake and see if he could find some raspberries. After he banked the fire, and while he was looking for the right wood up for his spearwood, he thought, and it all rolled together, just rolled together and rolled over him. These were things to do. So that had been chapter 11 of Hatchet. So in this chapter, we learn that Brian wants to make a signal fire, and he realized that he couldn't do that every day, and so he talks about all his things to do. Like I said, make the signal fire, and then he realized he could catch fish after observing a bird. So we'll see in hopefully future chapters that Brian's going to make a spear and hopefully catch some fish. So tune in tomorrow for chapter 12 of Hatchet. We hope to see you next time.